welcome to our latest episode of Security Noise. Can you wear a white hat after Labor Day? Anyway, that is our question for the day, and we are going to review some of the news and events over the summer for those of you who have been on vacation and we're just kind of checked out for the warm weather months. Today we have Dave Kennedy with us, which is, of course, always a special treat. You guys know him as the CEO of TrustedSec. We know him as Bossman, so it's always great when he can join us. Before we begin, I do want to mention our Discord server. You can go to discord.gg/TrustedSec if you want to join that and have some input on the show and other events, or if you just want to tell us what you'd like to hear about. And of course, as always, we have our producer, Skyler Tutor, here to make sure the show sounds great and probably to chime in a little bit today. Dave, why don't you take a minute to say hello to everybody since you've been away from the program for a bit.
Yeah, hey folks, pleasure to talk to everybody that listens and appreciate everybody's support on listening to the podcast. We get great feedback from that, and Skyler, Geoff, you guys do an amazing job. It keeps me, you're my weekly lawn mowing audio listening. So it's funny is I listen to the audio, I don't get to see the video, and Geoff, like you got a full goatee going, man. I haven't seen you with like a lot of this facial hair before. In the past. I don't know how long you've been growing that, if it's been like 6 years or 2 months, but looking good, man.
Summer's been good to you.
We're rolling into the cooler months now, so I thought I would let things go out. Maybe not get so much wind burn outside this year. I don't know. We'll see.
You got to be a lumberjack for Halloween.
That'd be fun. It's
yeah,
all
looking good
it's
though.
all
No, but glad to be on.
gray now, though. You know, that's the only thing. I'm gonna have to.
Mine too. Trust me. Like I've given up. Like I remember like 3 or 4 years ago, I found like my first white hair. I'm like, oh my God. And I plucked that out immediately. And there's no way I wouldn't have any more hair if I was plucking out the gray hair anymore. So I'm in the gray hair folks now. And I'm sure I'll be fully gray here in the next couple of years. So unless I dye my hair, which I'm not really into.
All right. Well, we'll just leave Skyler there with all the color. So
he looks very beautiful. Very beautiful.
Yes.
Thanks.
I don't know if I could say that. Is that an HR issue? Sorry.
Next week, we're going to have our head of HR on.
Sorry for everything Dave said on the podcast. We apologize to the audience.
It's not harassment if they like it. Anyway.
That's what I'm saying, right?
Hey, there's a soundbite.
So I did want to cover a couple of events over the summer. And, you know, one of the first things that popped up that was kind of interesting to me as I started paging back through the news earlier this week to look at some topics to cover for this show was the whole Salt Typhoon breaches and the National Guard. You know, that was a long period of time, I think March through December of 2024. So quite a lot of potential dwell time there. Again, more probably China hacking. I think that was kind of the final attribution there. But, you know, access to National Guard resources, evidence that they probably had the ability to pivot into other state and local agency assets through some of those networks. And I guess I'm just a little surprised that, you know, we didn't hear more about that because, you know, other than a handful of articles online, I don't think I saw a lot of coverage of it. Do you have any thoughts, Dave, on that one?
Well, it's interesting. So we have all these breach disclosure laws in the private sector, but what ends up happening and coming from the intelligence community and the IC area, you know, a lot of the things that occur from a nation state perspective really don't get published ever. And it's only when you have some sort of nuggets or tidbits that end up coming out. Even if you look at, obviously, Shadow Brokers was a high profile case because of the data and the leakage and the exploit code and things like that. But these types of breaches are actually happening all the time. They're just not publicly stated. And I testified in front of Congress a few different occasions talking about the issues that we face, you know, not just from a government perspective. I mean, this goes down to federal, state, and local. And we really don't get a big whiff of if our personal data is taken or military secrets or things like that. It never really reaches out to the public. And if you look at what Salt Typhoon, you know, specifically runs off of, you know, I think what it was reported was, you know, they registered some multiple domains through Proton Mail, unique domains for their C2 infrastructure and phishing campaigns. They were leveraging previously known exploits around Barracuda and a lot of other ones that were out there, some old CVEs. And if you look at a lot of the military infrastructure, you know, you have NIPRNet, SIPRNet, AWIX, NSANet, you know, all these heavily classified, you know, systems. Most of the time, those types of systems that are heavily classified are really well air-gapped and protected. So to get access to, you know, the classified infrastructure is a very, very, very difficult type of thing to do. Not saying that it isn't Swiss cheese on the inside. I'm not saying this from any knowledge from what I know on the inside. I'm just saying more so, you know, from what has been released publicly. But it's very, very much segmented off from the rest of the world, heavy cryptography, things like that. Very, very hard to get to. So what you're seeing here, from a National Guard perspective, is usually the unclassified infrastructure, and there's usually pretty decent segmentation across the board. Again, not perfect by any stretch, but it's not going to hold a lot of the troop preparedness stuff, troop movements, military policies, things like that. That's mostly reserved for more of the secret networks and top secret networks and things to that effect. So, while it's definitely a breach, it definitely exposes our government has a long ways to go when it looks at cybersecurity, and they're very far behind from protecting its infrastructure, including critical infrastructure. And we're just getting a little bit of a taste of it. And then what you see is it quickly gets washed up in other media cycles because they don't give any type of information about what was actually compromised, what was actually taken, what was actually stolen. And then we don't see the other side of that, right? So it's a problem. And I think there needs to be more disclosure laws in the federal government on, if there are major data breaches that impact national security, maybe those shouldn't be, discussed. But when unclassified network infrastructures, taken out, things like CISA releasing advisories on how it was compromised, its kill chain and everything else to release those TTPs and how they're operating. Those would be very beneficial for the private sector, to continue to build defenses against that, like we see with some of the other ones out there. And I know, CISA has a great red team. I know some of the folks that actually work on those teams, but it's a very small group that's tasked with doing the entire federal government, right? And that's huge. That attack surface is massive. And these are some of the largest companies in the world if you look at it from a employee and data perspective and everything that they have. And yet the security teams that they have are super tiny. So we need to be investing more in what we're doing from a defensive standpoint and testing our systems there than what's actually being done today.
Why is it, though, that I guess we don't hear more about this stuff? Because, from, again, looking at it, DoD type situation, it shouldn't probably be a budget thing given our nation's politics. And so I would think that they would probably be more forthcoming about the fact that these kind of attacks and stuff are happening, if nothing else, to draw attention to it and, get the action from Congress to do what they need to do to fix the problem. What do you think drives the, I guess, quietness around so much of this?
I think it's politics specifically. I think when you have these large, well, I think it's twofold, right? The cyber warfare front really hasn't, there's no lines of delineation of what constitutes like doing something illegal versus non-illegal in the cyber warfare front, because we hack into China all the time. They hack into us. We hack into Russia. They hack into us. We hack into North Korea. They hack into us. It's this tit for tat and going back and forth every single day for everything from intelligence related purposes, obviously from a China perspective, intellectual property theft, military preparedness. And, it's this constant battle that we see, and we get glimpses of it. If you remember Hafnium, where China hacked, all those public, that public infrastructure, there's no real reason for them to do that other than saying, we don't really care about what the United States does. And we're showing a sign of force. Had no intelligence gathering purposes, had no military preparedness one. So it's very out of the norm for what China operates by. But I think you're starting to see, a lot more of these events happen where, you have entire colleges like the Beijing Institute of Technology and others that, they work on behalf of the PLA, and they're doing, essentially creating dossiers and doing a lot of open source intelligence gathering and reconnaissance on different military installations, different branches of government, so that it can be selected for targeting that is beneficial for the government itself. So I think one of it is, it's part of normal operations of how they do things, and we're just accustomed to these breaches occurring. And then two, I think it's politics. No politician wants to look bad. I'll give you an example. When I was testifying in front of Congress, it was during the Obama administration, and I was there very nonpartisan. I just wanted to do what was right to help the government get better with cybersecurity. And I was perceived as a threat during that period of time because I was showing exposures that the federal government had during that period of time. And I got essentially threatened, saying if I ever testified again, I would be going to jail. And so I was like, okay, I'm never going to do this again. I'll never testify in front of Congress again. I'll never, I'm good. I'm fine. I don't need that. And I gave them everything ahead of time, let them know what I was going to testify about. I was not trying to go out there and make a name for myself, it was very stressful, to be perfectly honest with you, just trying to do the right thing and to help out. And I think, politics get in the way. I think, CISA is still a very new organization, and they've gotten a lot more responsibility. I think CISA's mission is phenomenal, but the problem they run into, if you look at critical infrastructure, for example, over 85% of our critical infrastructure is private sector owned. So they don't have a lot of control over our critical infrastructure, but they're working with those companies to provide guidance. They offer free penetration testing to these companies to, identify exposures. And most importantly, they have teams internally that will test federal government installations, federal branches, And they have pretty good rules and procedures. They've been very public about how they conduct their red team operations, how it works and things like that. But the agency that they're testing have to want that assessment done in the first place. It's not mandatory in any way. So I think there's a lot of emphasis still in this, and the benefits still to the federal government isn't a major focus for them. And the last thing I'll say about it is, I think, if you look at the media cycles, I used to do the news like 4 times a week, right? And whenever you see a big data breach happen now, it doesn't seem to get the media attention anymore. I think everybody has gotten so overburned out on all these breaches occurring that it doesn't make the news that it used to anymore. Unless it's something catastrophic or something major, these breaches every day seem to be like normal news, and maybe it gets a blurb from one of the analysts for like 2 minutes, and that's all the coverage it gets. So I think we're also seeing a lot of burnout on data breaches because it's just happening so often and so frequent.
I see that on our news cycles too, where they'll mention it in a short little blip, and even the news anchors are just kind of like, so be sure to change your passwords, and then they'll just move on. And that's where it lies nowadays.
Well, it's so hard for me because like every time I go on, it's the same thing that I've talked about for the past 10 years. Like, Dave, what can people do to protect themselves, from these types of attacks happening? I'm like, well, unfortunately, you really can't, because you're giving all of your information to these third parties, and those third parties are the ones that are getting breached. So even if you do all the most, amazing security practices by updating your phone and changing your passwords and all this other stuff, you're still impacted by this type of thing. So, obviously things like not using the same password everywhere, using multi-factor authentication, those types of things I can say to everybody, make sure you update your iPhone to the latest, iOS or Android version. But, those are just very small things in the grand scheme of things that don't really make a huge difference to these third-party data breaches that occur. And unfortunately, we have moved to this cloud type of model for everything. So all of our third-party services, all of our apps that we install, those are all third parties that have different passwords, different infrastructure that get compromised. And we're kind of at the beholden now of all of these companies to do the right thing, to do security breaches. But it's also created another storm where the breaches don't get the pain as they used to before, unless it's a massive ransomware event, right? And so these companies are doing less on cybersecurity because it's not hurting them as much, in the public eye and things like that. So I think we're kind of going back a few steps. And then you want to add things like vibe coding and AI coding that's coming out now, introducing substantial amount of security vulnerabilities through AI generated code. We're going back to like the 2000s, with Web 2.0 and everything else, with all of these applications that have all these data flaws again. It's all coming back again full circle with kind of like the next evolution of AI. So it's going to be an interesting, turbulent, I think, couple of years in the next few years for what we see.
Yeah, I mean, everybody already has free credit monitoring, so I mean,
I have like 6. So
right,
at this point in time, I'm like, there's like nothing I could do. Like, I was part of the major data breach where they had all of the clearance folks, and the government offered me, I think, like 5
OPM.
years of cause my clearance, OPM, yeah, because my clearance was stolen and everything else. So like, I'm used to it. Like, just take it. I mean, it's already out there. Like, if you go to find my social security number and everything else, it's there. Not my password.
I mean, that's just it. I don't think anybody pays attention even to the breach notifications anymore. Like you said, it really doesn't matter. And the AI thing too, again, there's kind of that gold rush effect going on there. And that takes us into our next story, which was, poor passwords tattle on hiring bot maker Paradox AI. And this is really an example. It's not necessarily even an AI thing. I think the password to the system was like 1234556. And so somebody just was beaten on the portal and logged in. And I know McDonald's was affected. There was a couple of other major organizations, stories over at Krebs Security, if anybody's looking for it. But there's some other Fortune 500s in there, I believe, just scrolling here. Lockheed Martin, Lowe's, Pepsi, all big names that pop out. And again, I got to believe, just based on the timing of this, these companies are probably like, we got to do AI stuff. We got to, get on board with AI hiring quick. Who can do that for us? And they ran over to, Paradox, who probably put together a system pretty fast to get in front of the market too. And, just not even crossing their I's, dotting their T's. Yeah.
Yeah. The AI stuff is so interesting to me because I use it all the time now. Like, you guys know my coding style. Like, I'm not the best developer in the world, but I can put together things like no one else's business, right? And everything from the social engineer toolkit to Magic Unicorn to other production things I've built. I helped build our endpoint agent and a bunch of other things internally. I love coding. I love it. It's like my passion. It's like my way of like relaxing and doing things, and that's always been my thing. But I'll tell you, when Gen AI came out, ChatGPT specifically, like the coding function, and that was just absolutely horrible. Like, I mean, it would hallucinate all the time. It would, write code that I didn't want it to write. It would rewrite functions that I didn't want it to touch. It was a mess. But you fast forward a few years later, and the ability to code things very fast, like I would say it sped up my development time probably 500%. To be able to write full-fledged applications very quickly and guide it along, how I want it architected, the type of coding I want it to do, secure coding practices. Like you can give it rule sets that allow it to, follow specific guidelines and architect a solution very quickly. Or even for quick things, like if I need to integrate into an API, I can be like, hey, go to this SDK file, this SDK stuff here, learn how their API works and build me a Python module that will integrate this application into my application using a REST API, and it'll build it all for me, where normally, it would take me a few hours, it takes me 5 minutes. And so I think the benefits are absolutely there. But the problem that you run into is, how do you get a good governance structure over AI so that your developers can leverage those tools without destroying all of your enterprise applications along with it? And then what do you actually apply AI to that's going to create cost synergies and cost benefits for your organization, or allow you to become more efficient or accurate, to improve your company in many ways? And I think that part still has to be determined, because I think everybody's just like, hey, we have to have AI, so let's just throw it everywhere in our entire company and hope for the best, when we don't really have a good rollout structure or even a well thought out plan about how that's actually going to work, nor do we have a way of actually securing it or putting it into our environment that has a sustainable model that's going to ensure the integrity of our infrastructure and architecture and everything else that goes along with our organization. So we have a long ways to go before that becomes a thing. And I've also noticed when I'm vibe coding, and I say I use vibe coding very selectively. So when it generates the code, I read through the code and I understand what the code is doing. And I understand this is areas that I would rewrite or do differently based on my programming knowledge or, security issues and things like that. But, there are developers that are just like, hey, I'm going to write this whole enterprise application through vibe coding. It's going to be 750,000 lines of code. It really could be shaved down to 20,000 lines of code, and it becomes unmanageable to even do coding changes or understand how the application works. We're just hoping it does it. And that's creating major problems for organizations, and it's not going to slow down anytime soon. It's going to get way worse. Yeah,
it's interesting because I've played with it a little bit too, and I've been using it more and more myself. And what I've found is it does a really great job just kind of mashing things together, like getting that REST API call to work, or tying WebSockets into, whatever you're doing so that things work. I look at it and I can read through the code and go, okay, except that doesn't really address that corner case. Whatever, I'm hacking, I don't care. And so it's really good for that.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious. I would expect it probably works pretty well for a project where you're the single developer, even if it's, a good size project for one developer. What I would wonder, and I need to probably talk to some of my friends who are still actively working as software developers, what it is like in the enterprise. Because, I think, how do you apply coding standards and stuff? I mean, you can run the linter later and reformat things and apply all those kind of rules, but fitting it into a larger, carefully architected software project where it's not the driver, some architect somewhere is, I do wonder how that works. And to the degree it creates kind of weird impedance problems that no one really looks at. And we're going to find a lot of kind of weird corner cases lurking in software later. Like you said, it may be back to the 90s a little bit. The whole architecture, too, around the way most of the chat bots and stuff get integrated, really bothers me. There's a lot of inline stuff, and it's like, didn't we spend the last 10 years getting away from inline signaling? And here we are. So it will be, it'll be fun to watch.
I'll tell you, I do think that this is a positive movement forward, but it's going to take a long time to get there, right? If you look at just yesterday, Repellent released their Agent 3, and I've been playing around with that, which is really good. It's literally a pop-up browser development IDE with, real-time collaboration, literally launcher code. It's getting very good at integrating into our developer process. The problem I have is it can absolutely be abused. Just like, by the way, a developer going to Stack Overflow and looking at some crap code that gets generated by somebody in the community and then plugging into their enterprise, right? So is there really a huge difference between that or somebody that's out there? My biggest concern with all of this specifically is that we have very seasoned developers that take 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to become experts in their individual area for writing code or being that enterprise application subject matter expert and things like that. if we switch to this type of model, how are these developers going to ever get that type of level of experience anymore to become those subject matter experts? So we're going to have this big gap area, very similar, by the way, to what's happening in InfoSec, where you have so many people coming into the field through college degrees and things like that, but there's no positions in place for people that don't know how to do certain types of functions or have the job experience to do that automatically. And so the development community is going to run into the same issue very quickly, where they're not going to be able to hire junior developers. They're going to have to rely off of AI. And how do you get those middle level or top tier developers in your environment to go and manage it? And one thing I saw that was really crazy is vibe coding is actually creating a new industry now within the development industry. There's basically vibe coding fixers now that specialize in fixing the code that's generated for vibe coding. And this is becoming a whole new area where you can hire, people that are skilled in development to fix the vibe coding code and to put it more in a structured format. So, it's creating a lot of upheaval that I don't think people really realize. And the problem is like the executives don't understand. They just say, hey, we have to do AI. We have to go all in on AI right now, or else we're going to be dropped behind from our competitors. And it's the same thing in cybersecurity. Every company out there is like, oh, we do AI this. And a lot of it, 99% of it's marketing fluff. And it really hasn't applied some substantial differentiators in the market space yet in cybersecurity. But, it's creating this crazy hype cycle where we have to get a little bit of a handle on this first, before I think it's going to actually create the benefits we're expecting it to be. So, again, I go back to it's going to be several years of a very rocky road that's going to disrupt a lot of how we do things. And that's going to thus have a major impact on cybersecurity and our ability to protect companies.
Yeah, it is interesting because I think it's not even just software development. It's not even just cybersecurity. It's really, this technology is going to create a lot of situations where there's ladders with no bottom rungs. And I don't know how we're going to adapt to that, because you can't go, or at least human beings can't go from no knowledge to, experts overnight. It doesn't work that way. You've got to build it through experience, and it has to get reinforced because, you read it in a book, but you don't believe it until you live it, like, yep. Comment my code. Sure. Whatever, professor. Yeah. Well, 10 years later, you're kind of like, okay, yeah, commenting your code is important. So.
It's funny. Like, there's sure sign ways of identifying if somebody is using vibe coding or not. Cause a lot of times the comment code has like ASCII art in it or like emojis, things like that. And then you can look at the structure. Like if you have like 7 massive files of like 20,000 lines of code, like, no one wants to go through that. I mean, the way I split my files up into different files, my application in different files, and I handle the functions in those different files so that I can just call them in when I need them, to keep code efficiency and things like that. Like vibe coding doesn't do that at all. It's like, hey, your server.py is going to be 572,000 lines of code, and it's going to import every single module possible known to humanity. And we're okay with that because it automatic, but it works. It's good. So it's going to be crazy. Like I'm excited because it's a whole new avenue. Like ChatGPT and, Claude and those ones, Anthropic, they've all replaced my Google searching. I don't use Google anymore. I just use, ChatGPT to pull the information I need to from things. And I think it's a big benefit in many ways to kind of understand a topic that's going on, or be able to understand what's happening in a certain area, or search for something I need knowledge in. But, we're using it. It's going to be abused very heavily to where it's going to, again, set us back to that early circa 2000, time frame. And we're going to pay the price for it. It's going to be heavy for a while. Speaking of heavy
and expensive exploits, the SharePoint 0 day, that was CVE 2025-53770. Not that long ago. I think it was late July or early August with that one. Have we heard the last of that? Just first of all, SharePoint comes around like all the time. Like SharePoint on premise is something that we should just expect that there's going to be a massive 0 day coming into, and either that or Exchange on premise. But it's interesting because a lot of organizations have moved to like Microsoft 365 and everything else, and so this SharePoint attack wasn't specifically didn't make the on-prem or the cloud offering vulnerable, right? So it was just on-premise solutions that we know of. But I think what's also interesting, going back to the AI topic, is I think we're starting to see, if you look at our threat intel team over at Binary Defense, a lot of these actors are using AI for source code analysis for 0 day research and fuzzing techniques and things like that. So, whereas you'd see, a lot of actors that would take a fresh exploit that came out or a new patch that came out, they would reverse engineer and they'd find that exploit and they would use that,
kind of in their campaigns and things like that, aside from phishing and brute forcing user accounts and stuff. I think you're going to start to see a lot more of these vulnerabilities come out with, code auditing tools that are coming out that are getting much better at identifying these flaws. And so that's particularly alarming. I think Microsoft's latest patch cycle this month was 86 critical vulnerabilities that were addressed. So I don't think anything's going away anytime soon. That's for sure.
Yeah, I guess what kind of caught my attention about this one is, one, it was a reliable exploit, which is
getting remote code execution on these are very difficult with all the protection mechanisms in place nowadays.
Yeah. And then I got to thinking, well, who has legacy SharePoint installs that, they can't upgrade and can't patch? And I mean, that to me is every kind of medium-sized business in the world who deployed SharePoint with Microsoft Learn open in one tab and their generalist IT guy RDP'd into the server in the other. And we all know that SharePoint, regardless of how you feel about the project and product in general, is if you install it that way, you usually end up in a situation where it becomes hard to patch, upgrade, manage later. And so it kind of surprises me that we haven't seen more, again, public services contractors, critical infrastructure type things. I'm thinking small local utilities, water departments, things like that, hit with this one.
Or were they hit and we just don't know about it?
Well, that's what I'm wondering. Is this coming back in the news? Have we not heard the last of it?
Well, a lot of these breaches that you see, it takes, especially the medium-sized businesses or small utility companies, takes them a very, very long time, one, to know that they were breached in the first place, because, a lot of these organizations don't have a very good patch management process, nor do they know what's on their external perimeter. And, we see this every day from a penetration testing perspective. And so, a lot of times they get notified by the FBI or CISA saying, hey, just so you know, you're part of this campaign and you're breached. And that's several months later, after the actors have had, gained access to their infrastructure for several weeks, months, or years. And so, I think the exploitation footprint was probably much larger than what is being reported. Just nobody knows about it yet. And it's going to take a long time. And then what ends up happening is twofold. So then the news is hyped right now on this, right? Or it was hyped during the SharePoint exploit. And everybody that understands cybersecurity was, we got to patch these systems immediately, critical, take them offline, whatever we got to do to go and do it. But then you have this whole, and this goes back to my whole philosophy on cybersecurity, is that cybersecurity is still very complex and very hard for small to medium-sized organizations to do effectively. And so now what's going to happen is, it's 6 months later, all of these companies now realize they're part of this massive campaign and breached. But the news cycle's already moved on to the next thing that's happened. And so you're not going to see that blip other than customer notifications going out or, FCC violations or, damages or things like that, report disclosures for that. You're not going to see that until 6 months later down the road. And so the news cycle's moved on and is no more news anymore. So it's, again, we struggle with small to medium sized businesses still in cybersecurity today. It's a tough one. It's a real tough one.
Well, those were the stories that I had logged over the summer. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to discuss before we wrap it up?
I think the prompt lock attack that's not really an attack, but it was purported as an attack from ESET is an interesting one because it goes back into the whole AI theme. But what's interesting is if you look at a lot of the tools that are coming out now, there's a tool out there, the name's escaping me. I think it's like Hexclad or something like that. Probably butchering the name there, which leverages, AI agents that automate a lot of the tools. I think it's like 150 tools in its arsenal, everything from Metasploit to Nmap to, scanners to parsing data and stuff like that uses agents to interpret those tools and then kind of run from a generative AI, prompt-based query to run your assessments and tests. Prompt lock was interesting because when ESET came out with it, it was one of the first pieces of code that we found that is leveraging AI as part of the attack chain process for actors. Now, it turned out that it was actually some researchers out of NYU, Tannin School of Engineering, and they did a proof of concept that basically took a C2 agent. Once it was deployed from initial access perspective, they were using ChatGPT's model for conducting the research for its LLM model, the one that's offline, specifically through Olama. And what they would do is it would query that to generate Lua scripts dynamically on each host to create things like ransomware events and stuff like that. And why that's so challenging for security programs is that a lot of times we rely very heavily off of previously discovered TTPs, methods that actors, groups and things like that, operate by, whether it's living off the land binaries and scripts or bring your own vulnerable kernel devices or whatever it ends up being. Or they're using Cobalt Strike or Meterpreter or Brute Retell or whatever. And so these we look for those specific indicators in our environments. And if an attacker is able to establish a C2 in your infrastructure, and then start to write custom code on those systems, without a previously defined signature or a previously defined attack vector. That becomes very challenging for defenders to be able to do those types of things. And so while this was a research study, it shows you what the capabilities are starting to become for these actors. And we have seen actors leveraging AI to generate their initial access stagers. So they'll use, so instead of having to rewrite a big tool and having to rework it every time it's discovered, they just restructure it again through, an LLM, and then it rewrites their code for them instantaneously. So they're back up and running within a few seconds, or a few minutes versus a week to retool it or a month to retool it. So it's increasing the attacker sophistication. But one thing that I don't think a lot of people realize about what's happening in this area now is that the way that the ransomware models used to work is you'd have some really skilled hackers, like one or two people that are in the top 1% in the ransomware groups, right? And they would build these amazing, sophisticated tools, these exploit tools and encryption tools and ransomware as a service tools that could be used as an infrastructure for a lot of these lower level groups that didn't have the sophistication levels, the coding techniques, the understanding, again, being an expert in your area. And what a lot of these models have done is lowered that bar. So now that these lower skilled hackers that never had those capabilities now have those capabilities to do those types of things. So now we are reaching out to a larger pool of hackers, which thus increases, the probability and risk of these types of events happening more often. So, it's coming and attackers are already leveraging it. I think it's just a matter of full adoption occurring in that market, very similar to the cybersecurity industry adopting AI. You're starting to see it happen very heavily in the attacker mindset as well.
Yeah, well, I guess AI summer for everybody may turn out to be AI winter for cybersecurity. We will see, I suppose.
It's called Hex Strike, by the way, is the name of the tool. Hex Strike. Yeah.
Hex Strike. Okay. Well, Dave, I want to thank you for joining us today, and I want to thank all of you guys for listening. Security Noise is a production of TrustedSec LLC. If you or your organization have any questions or needs regarding information security, go to www.trustedsec.com. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.